Let's begin here, because many people mistake attention for affection. A man may say he does not want commitment, yet he returns again and again. To many, this seems like proof of care, but his presence is not always love. It can be a cycle, a pattern of disappearance and return, leaving the heart unsettled. One half longs to believe his return means change, while the other half knows the ground beneath is still fractured. This is the paradox: closeness without promise, intimacy without clarity. And it is here, in this tension, that the true work begins. Before I continue, let me know where you're listening from in the comments. And if reflections like this resonate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Too many chase what disappears, thinking it can be held with more effort. But Jung observed that what we chase often turns to shadow. The harder we cling to it, the more it slips away, and the more we lose ourselves in the process. The persona, that outer mask of confidence, says I am fine with this arrangement. But the deeper self whispers, I need more than fleeting visits. When we silence that voice, we walk on broken glass pretending it does not cut. The truth is that his contradiction is not yours to fix. His words, I don't want anything serious, rise from fear of loss, fear of being consumed, fear of surrender. And yet, his body and his soul still seek the warmth of connection. It is not about your worth, but about his split. One part of him resists, the other reaches forward. You stand in the middle, torn between hope and resignation, asking which part to believe. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like a chemical reaction. Both are changed if they truly touch. But too often we settle for sparks without transformation. We confuse a repeated cycle with a bond. We tell ourselves that his return is progress, when in truth it is only orbit without landing. And yet, within this paradox is an invitation. An invitation to see clearly, to recognize the shadow at play, and to choose a different way of standing. This first part is only the opening. It sets the stage for a deeper exploration of masks, shadows, choices, and the magnetic presence that reshapes love itself. The woman who learns this no longer waits at a half-open door. She walks forward steady in her worth, ready for what is true. The first fracture always comes quietly. It is not a loud collapse, but a subtle split, like hairline cracks in a mirror that only show when the light strikes at a certain angle. A woman hears the words that undo her certainty. I don't want anything serious. Yet even as those words land with weight, the gestures that follow seem to say the opposite. He still calls, still reaches, still lingers close. This is the contradiction that unsettles the soul, the sharp edge between presence and absence. At first, many explain it away. They say he is only confused, that more time will bring clarity, that his return means his heart is secretly committed. But time does not heal a fracture left unacknowledged. It only deepens the divide. Each cycle of leaving and returning reopens the wound, and soon the heart carries a rhythm of bruises. What felt like affection becomes uncertainty, and what felt like connection becomes a shadow of fear. Jung once noted that contradictions are not accidents, but gateways. When two opposing truths collide, they reveal the deeper structure of the psyche. In this case, the man's persona, the mask of independence and freedom, speaks of distance, but another part of him, the anima stirred by closeness, continues to reach. The woman is caught, not between two men, but between two halves of the same man, each pulling in opposite directions. And in that space, her own fracture begins. Her outer mask, the persona she presents, says she is patient, understanding, unshaken. She smiles when he returns, answers the late-night call, agrees to meet again. Yet inside, the shadow whispers something else. The shadow knows the cost of walking on glass, the cost of waiting at a door that never fully opens. It says, "You want more than this. You are worth more than this." But to acknowledge that voice means risking loss, and so the conflict grows. This is how the fracture spreads. Every return becomes less about joy and more about survival. Half of the heart leans toward hope, convinced that this time will be different. The other half braces for the inevitable retreat. The soul lives in a state of divided loyalty, faithful to the dream of connection, yet exhausted by the reality of its absence. It is like standing at the edge of a shoreline, watching the waves approach and retreat, knowing they will never stay. In psychological terms, this is the tension between projection and reality. The woman projects her longing for stability onto the man, reading his return as proof of hidden devotion. But the reality is more complex. His words and his unconscious are at war, and his conflict does not resolve hers. Projection acts as a veil, blinding her to the fracture within herself. She no longer asks what she truly wants. She only asks how long she can endure what he offers. The danger of this fracture is subtle but profound. When we silence our deeper needs, we begin to live in fragments. The persona, eager to appear accommodating, insists that the situation is acceptable, but the inner self begins to fade, hidden behind compromises and quiet disappointments. Jung described this as the withering of individuation, the slow loss of the path toward wholeness. The fracture in the relationship becomes a fracture in the soul. Consider how many sleepless nights are born from this very paradox. The mind replays conversations, searching for signs. Did his tone mean change? Did his touch mean more than he admitted? Each memory is dissected, not to find truth, but to preserve hope. The body carries the stress, tight shoulders, restless breathing, fatigue that no rest cures. The psyche carries the deeper wound, a gnawing sense that love must always arrive, with conditions that worth must always be negotiated. Here is the hidden cruelty of the fracture. It convinces us that the cycle is evidence of value. If he leaves, but returns, then surely it means we are irreplaceable. But in truth, the cycle itself is proof of his split, not of devotion. It is not loyalty, but repetition. And repetition is not love. Recognizing this requires courage, for it means admitting that what feels like intimacy maybe only orbit closeness without center attachment, without anchor. Jung's insights remind us that such moments are not punishments, but mirrors. They reflect where we have yet to claim our own ground. The woman who finds herself trapped in this paradox is not weak nor foolish. She is simply confronting the universal wound of projection, the tendency to place our longing for wholeness onto another. The fracture reveals not just his split, but her own, and only by facing that truth can the path forward begin. To ignore the fracture is to live in denial. To demand he repair it is to hand over power. But to name it To say, I feel the split all, I see the contradiction is the first step toward healing. The fracture is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of awareness. Jung called this the work of consciousness to bring light into the shadow to make the unseen seen. Only then can wholeness return. This part of the journey is painful because it strips away illusions. It forces a woman to admit that affection without commitment leaves her adrift. It confronts her with the truth that no one can hold both sides of the fracture for long. And yet in that confrontation lies the seed of transformation. For what the shadow reveals, the self can reclaim. The fracture shows us what we have avoided. It reveals the hidden contract we signed without words that we would accept half measures in exchange for closeness. But the soul does not thrive on half measures. The soul longs for wholeness, for union that honors both presence and promise. To live otherwise is to starve in the midst of plenty, to drink from a cup that never fills. So, this is the first fracture, the moment when words and actions no longer align, when the surface of the relationship can no longer cover the depth of its conflict. It is the moment when the mask slips, when the heart begins to question, when the shadow whispers louder than the persona can silence. And it is from this fracture that the next stage will unfold the confrontation between shadow and persona. The battle between what is shown to the world and what is hidden within. For now, it is enough to see the crack clearly, to recognize that what breaks us open can also break us free. When the first fracture appears, most try to cover it. The surface mask. The persona steps forward and insists that everything is fine. She smiles, nods, and carries on, as if her heart has not been torn in two. The persona is skilled at this performance. It wants harmony, it wants acceptance, and it believes that silence will preserve both. Yet beneath the mask, something older and more primal begins to stir the shadow. The shadow does not speak politely. It whispers through unease, through restlessness, through the ache of knowing that this arrangement is unsustainable. It demands recognition. And when the shadow rises, it collides with the persona's calm display. This is the inner battle many women face. In silence, one self saying, and stay patient. He will change, while another insists you are losing yourself in waiting. The fracture now becomes a battlefield between two inner voices. Jung observed that the persona is necessary for social life, but it becomes dangerous when it hardens into a lie. To smile while feeling broken, to act content while feeling empty. This is the false contract the persona writes, and it costs dearly. The woman begins to live divided, outwardly agreeable, inwardly wounded. She learns to mask her disappointment, even as it gnaws at her well-being. The shadow grows darker in response, because what is denied does not disappear. It gathers strength in silence. Think of the mirror as a symbol here. The mirror reflects both what we show and what we hide. The persona stands before it, rehearsing composure. The shadow lingers at the edges, waiting to be acknowledged. If we only see one reflection, we live a partial life. But when both come into view, the tension becomes undeniable. And it is this tension that reveals the stakes, dignity, self-worth, even the very sense of identity. The costs of ignoring this struggle are high. Every cycle of leaving and returning deepens the shadow's voice. Why do you accept less than you deserve? Yet the persona, desperate to avoid abandonment, replies, because some closeness is better than none. This is the unspoken contract. Accept half measures in exchange for temporary security. The danger lies not only in the man's indecision, but in her willingness to silence her own truth. Here lies the deeper pattern. When the persona dominates a woman, becomes what she thinks he wants, easygoing, undemanding, endlessly available. But the shadow knows this is a mask. It remembers her longing for real intimacy, for partnership rooted in respect. The clash between shadow and persona creates exhaustion because it requires living two lives at once. The outer life appears calm, but the inner life trembles with doubt and longing. Jung taught that the shadow is not evil. It is simply the part of us we refuse to claim. In this situation, the shadow carries her rightful anger, her sense of worth, her hunger for more. To deny it is to deny her wholeness. Yet claiming it feels risky. For to claim it means risking loss, risking solitude, risking the collapse of the fragile bond. And so many women stay suspended in this tug of war, hoping the mask will be enough to bridge the gap. But shadows do not remain silent forever. They speak through the body, through fatigue, through sleeplessness, through the heaviness of unspoken truth. They speak through patterns of thought, through the cycle of replaying conversations, through the ache of recognizing the same disappointments repeated again and again. The longer the shadow is ignored, the more it demands expression. And the persona, no matter how polished, begins to crack under the weight. Here is the paradox. The mask promises protection, but it is the mask that deepens the wound. To smile while hurting is to betray oneself. To act patient while empty is to abandon the soul. The shadow in its raw insistence is not the enemy. It is the voice of life pressing for recognition. Jung would say that until the unconscious is made conscious, it will direct our life, and we will call it fate. In this case, the fate is repetition, the endless cycle of leaving, returning, and breaking again. The unspoken contract must be named. It says, I will accept less if only you will stay. But the cost of this bargain is profound. It trades authenticity for proximity, dignity for scraps of affection. And no soul can flourish under such terms. The mask cannot forever hide the truth that the shadow insists upon, that love without clarity is not love, that presence without commitment is absence in disguise. This stage of the journey is often the most painful, because here the illusions still hold sway. The persona whispers that keeping peace is safer than risking loss. The shadow whispers that truth is more important than comfort. The tension stretches across every choice. Do I wait or do I speak? Do I hold back or do I reveal? In this tension, the woman discovers the depth of her own split, and until it is faced, the cycle will repeat. Yet there is hope, even here. For the presence of the shadow is not only a warning, but also an invitation. It signals that the self will no longer tolerate fragments. It demands recognition, not to destroy, but to heal. To integrate the shadow is to say, I want more, and I will not apologize for it. This is the beginning of individuation, the movement toward wholeness, where both mask and shadow find their rightful place. The man's contradiction mirrors her own. His persona says freedom. His unconscious says closeness. Her persona says patience. Her shadow says longing. Both are split. Both are incomplete. The difference is this: she has the power to face her own split while his remains hidden. To face it is to step out of illusion and into truth. To face it is to begin reclaiming power. The mirror once fractured can either shatter or be reforged. If she continues to deny the shadow, the fracture widens until the self feels lost. But if she dares to look into the cracks, she sees the deeper reflection, the woman behind the mask, the truth behind the persona. And that sight, painful as it may be, is the first glimpse of freedom. This is the heart of part 3, the confrontation between mask and shadow, between what is shown and what is hidden. It is a dangerous territory, but also a sacred one. For only in this confrontation can the woman begin to see herself clearly, and only in that clarity can she move toward the awakening that follows the moment when the fracture becomes a doorway and the shadow becomes the guide toward wholeness. Awakening rarely comes as a sudden flash. More often, it unfolds slowly, like dawn pressing through the edges of a darkened room. The heart, weary of pretending, begins to realize what the mind has avoided. The split between mask and shadow can no longer be maintained. The persona says patience. The shadow says truth. And in this clash, a deeper voice begins to rise, the voice of the self. This voice does not bargain. It does not plead. It simply reveals. It whispers that waiting endlessly for another's clarity is a way of abandoning oneself. It shows that the real prison is not his indecision, but her silence about her own worth. What once felt like loyalty is recognized as self-denial. This recognition is painful, but it is also liberating, for it turns the fracture into a doorway. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming whole, a union of opposites within the self. In this context, the awakening begins when a woman sees that her wholeness does not depend on his choice. She discovers that the contradiction is his to resolve, but the boundary is hers to claim. In this light, his returning and retreating are no longer the center of the story. The true center shifts inward toward the reclamation of her own ground. This is where magnetic presence begins to form. Magnetic presence is not about persuasion or tactics. It is the natural radiance that arises when a woman stands fully in herself, calm, clear, and unattached to outcome. It is not born from anxiety, but from alignment. In this state, she no longer performs patience to keep him close, nor does she explode in demands to force change. She simply embodies her worth with quiet certainty, and this changes everything. Consider the symbolism of alchemy. The old texts describe transformation as the union of opposites: fire and water, sun and moon, masculine and feminine. At first, the elements clash, resisting each other's nature. But through steady presence, they are fused into something higher, something whole. In the same way, her calm clarity becomes the container in which his contradiction is confronted. She does not chase, nor does she flee. She holds steady, and in that steadiness, the dynamic shifts. Neuroscience offers a parallel insight. When the body is calm, when fear and desperation no longer dominate, a different chemistry takes place. Anxiety tightens the bond of fear, but clarity releases it. In that release, a new possibility emerges. The man who says he does not want commitment, yet continues to return, begins to feel something unfamiliar, a safe space that does not demand, yet does not diminish itself to accommodate him. This unsettles his patterns because it forces him to meet her on a different level. The awakening is not about controlling him, it is about freeing her. It is the recognition that her value is not diminished by his hesitation. It is the moment she chooses presence over pursuit boundaries, over bargains. This choice carries power because it breaks the old cycle. Instead of orbiting his contradiction, she creates her own gravity, her own center. In this new alignment, she becomes not a seeker of scraps, but the keeper of her own wholeness. Notice the contrast. The old way said, "If I am agreeable enough, he will stay." The awakened way says, "If I am true to myself, I will be whole, whether he stays or not." This is the alchemy of opposites, the transformation of fear into clarity, of longing into strength. What once felt like helplessness now becomes a form of authority, not over him, but over her own life. In Jungian language, this is the confrontation with the inner archetypes. The anxious persona gives way to the sovereign feminine, the one who knows her worth without needing proof. This archetype does not chase validation. She magnetizes respect by embodying it. Her presence calls forth the counterpart. In the man, the conscious masculine, who knows how to commit without losing himself. Whether he rises to that call is his journey. But her awakening is no longer tied to his decision. This is the paradox. The less she tries to hold him, the more his unconscious feels drawn to return. Not because she plays a game, but because the dynamic of dependence has dissolved. He senses, even if he cannot name it, that something sacred has entered the space between them. The air no longer carries desperation, it carries dignity. The dance no longer circles endlessly, it opens toward transformation. But we must be clear. Awakening does not guarantee a particular outcome. It does not promise that he will suddenly commit, nor does it ensure that the bond will deepen. What it does promise is freedom. Freedom from the endless cycle of waiting and wondering. Freedom from the unspoken contract that trades truth for closeness. Awakening returns her life to her. It restores her energy, her clarity, her sense of purpose beyond this one relationship. The symbols of awakening are subtle. A mirror no longer frightens her because she no longer fears what the shadow might show. A door no longer represents endless waiting because she knows she can walk through her own. A silence no longer feels like punishment because it becomes the space where her true voice emerges. These symbols are not external. They are the language of the psyche announcing its shift. Jung wrote that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. Awakening means she no longer fears the reaction. She knows that whether or not he transforms, she will. She has stepped into a deeper relationship with herself, one where the shadow is no longer an enemy, but an ally guiding her back to wholeness. From this point, the story turns. The fracture is no longer only pain, it becomes possibility. The mask and the shadow, once at war, begin to integrate. The woman no longer denies her need for clarity, nor does she drown in fear of abandonment. She becomes both tender and strong, receptive and firm. This integration is the essence of awakening. It is the recognition that opposites need not destroy each other. They can unite into a new form of life. And so the awakening is not a grand event, but a quiet shift. It is a steady turning of the soul toward its own light. It is the moment when she stops asking, "Will he choose me?" and begins to ask, "Am I choosing myself?" In that question lies the seed of transformation, a seed that grows into the act of boundary and choice that follows. Awakening is only the beginning. Awareness alone does not transform a life. At some point, recognition must be followed by decision, and decision by action. This is the moment where awakening becomes embodied, where clarity becomes boundary. Without this step, awareness risks becoming another mask, another philosophy held at a distance from lived experience. True change begins when a woman translates insight into standards and standards into choices. Here, the shadow no longer whispers, it demands. It insists that she can no longer accept half measures disguised as closeness. It asks her to walk a new path, one that affirms her dignity, even if it costs her the comfort of familiarity. Jung taught that individuation always requires sacrifice, the letting go of illusions, the burning away of old roles, the willingness to disappoint others to remain faithful to oneself. This is that sacrifice. From this place, 3 doors appear. The first door leads to conscious acceptance. She may decide to remain in the connection, as it is, without expectation of change, and find joy in the moment-to-moment experience. But now she does so knowingly, without projecting hidden hopes onto his return. The second door leads to release. She may decide that her long-term desire for commitment requires space, and she gently steps away to make room for someone aligned with her truth. The third door leads to transformation. She may hold the connection without clinging, stating clearly what she desires while allowing him to rise or not, without losing herself in the process. Each door is valid, provided it is chosen consciously. What matters is not the man's choice, but her own. To choose from fear is to shrink. To choose from clarity is to expand. The soul does not demand one outcome over another. It demands that choices reflect the truth of the inner self. This is the meaning of a boundary. It is not a wall of defense, but a declaration of alignment. This is who I am. This is what I value, and this is how I choose to live. Symbolically, this moment is like standing before a threshold. Behind her lies the cycle of repetition, his leaving and returning, her hoping and doubting. Before her lies the unknown, a road not yet walked. To cross it requires courage, because the unknown always carries risk. But Jung reminded us that the greatest risk is to avoid the unknown entirely, to cling to what is familiar while the soul withers. To step across the threshold is to honor the deeper voice within. Notice how the old patterns begin to dissolve once the boundary is spoken. The anxious calls to persuade or prove lose their power. The need to interpret his every gesture fades. Instead, a calm clarity enters the space. She can now say, with steady voice, I value this connection, but I also value my future. I am open to what may grow here, but I will not close myself off to what aligns with my deeper desires. Such words do not beg, nor do they accuse. They stand in truth, and truth, spoken calmly, has its own authority. This authority shifts the energy. The man who once held control, through contradiction, now faces a new reality. He is no longer the sole author of the dynamic. She has reclaimed her pen. Whether he chooses to step closer or to retreat, the power of decision is no longer entirely his. This balance alters the field between them. He feels, perhaps for the first time, the necessity of rising to meet her clarity rather than expecting her to orbit his uncertainty. Yet the deeper transformation lies not in him, but in her. By drawing a boundary, she becomes whole again. The shadow, once denied, is now integrated into her voice. The persona, once strained to appear agreeable, now aligns with her true self. The mask and the shadow no longer wage war. They have fused into a more authentic presence. This is the individuation process. In practice, opposites reconciled, truth embodied. Boundaries are not merely about romance. They ripple outward into every part of life. A woman who learns to set them here will find the same clarity in friendships and work and family. She will no longer accept being diminished to maintain false peace. She will speak truth without apology, and in doing so, she will attract what resonates with her deeper worth. The act of boundary setting is not only about protecting the heart, it is about shaping a life that reflects the soul's integrity. It is important to see that this transformation is not loud. It does not require harsh ultimatums or dramatic exits. Its power lies in its steadiness. It is the quiet refusal to betray oneself any longer. It is the simple but profound act of choosing self-respect over fear. And this quietness is precisely why it is magnetic, because it signals a woman who knows her value without needing to shout it. Jung wrote that real growth occurs in the tension of opposites. Here, the opposites are clear: the desire for closeness and the need for freedom, the fear of loss and the pull of authenticity. By holding this tension, without collapsing into either extreme, she becomes the alchemical vessel in which transformation occurs. In this vessel, her worth is no longer tied to his indecision. It flows from her own choice to live aligned with truth. This is why the boundary is both a choice and a gift. It protects her from further harm, but it also offers him a mirror. If he can face it, he may glimpse his own contradiction more clearly and be invited to grow. If he cannot, then the path parts without her losing herself in the process. In either case, she wins not through victory over another, but through fidelity to herself. So this is the act of transformation, the moment when she no longer asks, will he change, and begins to ask, how will I live my truth? It is the movement from passivity to sovereignty from fracture to integration. And in this movement, the endless cycle of waiting and wondering dissolves. What replaces it is not certainty about the future, but certainty about the self. From here, the journey moves toward closure. Not closure in the sense of endings alone, but closure as integration, as the weaving of lesson into life. The story is no longer about his contradiction. It is about her wholeness, her freedom, and the wisdom she carries forward. And this, in the language of Jung, is the true beginning of individuation, the path toward living as one undivided self. Every journey must arrive at a place of rest. And here, after the fracture, the conflict, the awakening, and the boundary, we come to the final turning. The question is no longer about him, whether he stays, whether he commits, whether he chooses. The question is about her, about you, about all of us who have walked this cycle of longing and return. What remains when the illusion fades? What remains when we no longer wait at a half-open door? The answer is sovereignty, the deep recognition that self-worth is not dependent on another's hesitation. Sovereignty does not mean isolation. It means wholeness. It means that love may enrich, but never define your existence. It is the quiet authority of knowing that you are already complete and that no external promise can add or subtract from that truth. This is the real freedom, to live without fear of abandonment because you no longer abandon yourself. To offer affection without anxiety because you no longer measure your worth by someone else's readiness. To walk through life knowing that your dignity is not a bargaining chip, but the foundation of your being. Jung taught that individuation is the path toward becoming undivided. And what is individuation if not the healing of the very split we began with? He could not decide between closeness and freedom. You could not decide between patience and truth. But the path has revealed that the choice was never his to give, nor yours to beg for. The choice was always this: will you honor the self, or will you deny it? This recognition transforms the entire story. It shifts the narrative from one of waiting for him to one of awakening in yourself. It turns the repeated cycle into a teaching, a mirror reflecting the places you once gave away your power. And in seeing this, you are free, not because the man changes, but because you have changed. The fruits of this freedom are quiet but profound. The body releases its tension. Sleep returns more easily. The heart beats without the constant rhythm of dread and relief. Your voice no longer trembles when you speak your needs, because those needs are no longer a source of shame. The soul begins to shine again, no longer dimmed by compromise. Symbolically, you have walked through a series of thresholds. The fracture was the crack in the old wall. The shadow was the voice calling from the dark. The awakening was the opening of the door. The boundary was the act of stepping through. And closure is what waits on the other side, a landscape that is both familiar and new, because it is the same world, yet you walk through it with new eyes. Some may ask, does this mean she always walks away? No. Closure is not about endings. It is about integration. It is about carrying the lesson forward regardless of outcome. If the bond continues, it does so on new ground where her dignity remains intact. If it ends without bitterness, because she no longer confuses his split with her value. In either case, she wins, not over him, but over the old self that once settled for less. This is the lesson to choose self-respect over fear, presence over performance, clarity over compromise. To remember that love is not proven by repetition, but by alignment. To understand that the deepest attraction is born not from chasing, but from wholeness. This is what Jung meant when he said that only the meeting of two whole individuals can create real transformation. When you stand in your sovereignty, you become that whole person. And so the story closes not with despair, but with renewal. What began as a cycle of absence and return becomes a path of individuation. What once felt like rejection becomes revelation. What once drained your energy now refines your soul. You no longer wait to be chosen because you have already chosen yourself. This is not pride nor arrogance. It is balance. It is the natural peace that comes when the inner and outer selves are no longer divided. As you listen now, reflect on where this touches your own life. Have you stood at doors that never fully opened? Have you worn masks that silenced your truth? Have you felt the whisper of your shadow, asking for more than fragments? If so, remember this: the fracture was never meant to destroy you. It was meant to awaken you. Jung wrote that in the space between opposites lies the possibility of alchemy. You have lived that alchemy. The tension between patience and longing, closeness and freedom, fear and clarity has produced something greater. A self that is whole, calm, and free. This is your treasure. No one can take it. And so, as we close this reflection, carry this truth with you. Real love does not dim your light, it reflects it. Real connection does not fracture your soul, it strengthens it. And real freedom is not found in avoiding loss, but in refusing to lose yourself. Take a moment. Now let this settle. If these words have spoken to your journey, share what part touched you most in the comments. Your reflection may become the very light another soul needs.